This is the Mormon Mixed Faith Marriage podcast with certified life coach Brooke Booth, episode number 148. So it should be the first week of December or thereabouts when this podcast is published, which means the election was not that long ago, probably a few weeks now. I want to talk about politics in a mixed faith marriage because it's not, well, for a lot of reasons. Okay, for a lot of reasons. One, this political campaign was a lot for most of us. Two, when there's a mixed faith marriage, there is often a mixed political marriage, if you will. Often that comes hand in hand, not always. But I want to discuss what it's like to be in a mixed political marriage too, in addition to a mixed faith marriage, because that can add another layer of things to work through, another layer of things to be aware of as you also navigate your mixed faith marriage. And especially with an election and the results of the election, and all of the stuff that comes along with that, it brings up a lot of stuff. There are things you want to talk about with your spouse and work through in all of this. Not long ago, I was playing pickleball in some public courts. I love playing tennis, love playing pickleball. Anyways, playing pickleball, and there was like a group of pickleball players who clearly meet on a regular basis and like round robin. They don't know each other, but they're acquaintances. And so I was listening to their conversation because yes, that is what I do when I play pickleball or tennis is I listen to the conversations next to me. I cannot help myself. Um, once we played pickleball, no, we were playing tennis, and there were like an eighth grade or ninth grade tennis team of just all boys. Oh my goodness, those conversations were hilarious. But I digress. The pickleball conversation is what I'm talking about. They were both retired people. There was a man and a woman, and they clearly like didn't really know each other well. They weren't friends. They were just people who, were in the same pickleball club and would sometimes play pickleball with each other. And they started to talk about the debate. There had recently been a debate, and so they started to talk about the one of the debates, and it got heated pretty quickly. They were definitely a mixed political pickleball partnership, if you will. And I got uncomfortable, frankly, with their conversation. I can only imagine how they felt. And then and then they started to play doubles. They were playing singles and they started to play doubles and they continued on with the conversation. And the new people are like, oh no, 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 no. We don't talk politics at pickleball. And they moved on to other conversations. And I thought about that conversation a lot because that solution worked really well for a group of people who want to come together and play pickleball on a given Saturday morning. It worked great. Where they just sort of have a moratorium, like we don't go there, we don't talk about that. You hear it a lot. No politics and no religion at the dinner table or whatever. That's the approach they took. And I think it works really great when you're playing pickleball with a bunch of people from your community. How do you do it in your marriage? Now, this is something I actually talk with clients quite a bit about mixed political marriages. Again, because as I mentioned earlier, it's a pretty common dynamic once there's a mixed faith marriage. So let's talk about that today. Like, what do you do when your votes cancel each other out? Can you just say we don't talk politics in this marriage? Like, is that a viable option? How to navigate this difference? So this is what I want you to consider because the difference here for some people, like it's going to be different for different people depending on your relationship. For some people, this is incredibly sensitive. For other people, they're like, yeah, whatever. So I'm going to give you some general principles to consider that can apply to you regardless of the level of stress or anxiety or discomfort that this brings to you in your marriage. So, four things I want you to consider if you are in a mixed political marriage. One, what are your values? I want you to really take some time to explore your values as it deals with politics. Like, what are your political values? A lot of times we don't really explore these. I've talked about exploring your values in past podcasts. All of that applies here too. A lot of times we're not very creative. We think about this very narrowly. We don't really explore our values. We just assume values other people tell us should be ours, or we assume values without thinking critically or introspectively about what our or your values are. So I want you to think about this before we get into mixed political stuff and how to deal with it in your marriage and all of that. Really think it's helpful to take some time to figure out what your values are when it comes to politics. So you have a crystal clear understanding of what's important to you and anchor yourself in those values as you make your decisions. Because then you'll be making value-based decisions on what to talk about and what not to talk about, on how to vote, on what to vote about, what not to vote about, on all of those things. And that will give you a much better position to do anything moving forward. And that can take a while. That can take a minute. That can take some work. What are your values? And then how do those values rank in position to other values you have in your life? This is a big, kind of hairy thing I'm talking about here, but well worth your time. Explore your political values and then explore how they rank compared to other values. When I talk about other values, it could be faith values, it can be familial values, it can be relationship values, it can be money values, it can be hard work values, anything else. I want you to understand yourself here. I want you to understand where your political values rank compared to your other values and what they are. Then I want you, with that information, it's going to be much easier to do number 2. What are your non-negotiables when it comes to politics? What are your non-negotiables for your relationship? For some people, once they explore their values and they start asking their non-negotiables, they're definitely not going to want to be partnered with somebody who cannot also support their same political view. That's just how it's going to be for them. And that's okay. People get to choose their own non-negotiables. People get to choose their own values. People get to choose their own partners. And if they do all of this work and they come to the conclusion of like, nope, it's absolutely necessary that my partner shares my political values, that's good information for you to know. Now, for other people, it won't be a big deal. They're going to be like, yeah, that's nice, but not necessary. You get to decide this. So what are your non-negotiables? Is it a big deal? Is it not a big deal? How important is that for you in the context of your relationship? Like what your partner's political views are, political actions are, political point of view. Like you get to decide what that means for you and your marriage. Are there any non-negotiables? Those first 2 can be really scary to do because the answers can be scary to confront. But they can also be empowering and they can also be clarifying. Okay, principle number 4 I want to talk about, and this has to do with setting boundaries. So once you get really clear on your values and what your non-negotiables are, this is when you might want to set some boundaries. I'll give you an example. So what you want to do around a boundary is this is where you're protecting the relationship and where you're deciding what you are going to do in a particular event or situation or circumstance to protect yourself, to protect the relationship so that you don't have resentment or frustration build up that will ultimately harm the relationship. Sometimes you might need to set some boundaries, maybe on what's discussed or where things are discussed or how long things are discussed or who you discuss things with. I don't know. This is something that once you explore your values and you explore your non-negotiables, the boundaries that you may or may not need to set will become more clear to you. It's going to be different for everybody. So when I give you an example here of boundary, I want you to know this is very specific to me and my value exercise. and my non-negotiables. So this is an example of a boundary I needed to set with my extended family. This was years ago, in fact. My in-laws love to talk politics. They're highly political. They write letters to the editor, they give money, they march on the Capitol. They march on their own state capitol on a regular basis. They do things like this all of the time. They are very politically invested and interested, and it's something they love to talk about. We were once on a long car trip with them, and so I'm setting the scene here. I'm in a car on a long trip, multiple states. I can't simply get out of the car. I can't simply, walk away from the conversation. And my father-in-law was talking about immigration and sharing some immigration anecdotes with my husband. And he was animated and he was interested. And this was something he definitely wanted to talk about with my husband. I believe I was driving and my husband was sitting in the passenger seat and my father-in-law was right behind us in the second row seat. He was leaning forward, wanting to tell my husband all of his thoughts, feelings about these immigration anecdotes. Now, I was in the driver's seat, so I was listening to the conversation not by choice, but just because I was right there. I couldn't turn off my ears. And I listened for a while, and I could feel my own frustration, discomfort build. And I realized that this wasn't going to work for me for the next 6 hours or however long we were going to be in a car. So the boundary I set is I asked them to not have that conversation while I was there in the car, that they could yes, please have this conversation later when I don't need to be a forced listener, when I don't need to be a forced participant. Please talk all you want about your immigration opinions and share all the anecdotes you want. But my request was, can you not do that right here while I'm sitting here, because I don't have an option whether to listen or not. And that's an example of a boundary I set once years ago. And hear me, that was not easy. That was very uncomfortable for me to set that boundary. But I knew the discomfort of asking them to, change the topic of conversation would be less than the discomfort of me losing my temper in another 15 minutes or saying something scathing or unkind or pointed in the next 15 minutes. And I was merely balancing out the long-term repercussions in this relationship and trying to choose the lesser. Boundaries are hard, but they can really protect relationships. So that's something you might need to do in a mixed political relationship, is you might need to set boundaries. But I want to comment a little bit more about that, because you may not want to have a relationship where you can't ever talk about politics, reference back to the pickleball conversation. And that's why I asked, what are your values and what are your non-negotiables? Because if you truly, truly value talking openly and frequently about politics and about your opinions and about their opinions and about what's going on in the world, and that's something you want to have in your marriage, in your romantic relationship, then that's something you value. And maybe a non-negotiable for you is that you never talk about these things. Maybe that's exactly what a non-negotiable would be for you. That is so good for you to know about yourself, so you can craft and create the kind of relationship and the kind of skills and the kinds of conversations that need to be had, so you can have those needs met, so you can have those values honored, so you can create a relationship, make decisions based on your values. And again, that's going to be different for different people. So that's why I started with, what are your values and what are your non-negotiables? Because for some people, they don't ever need to talk about politics in their marriage. And for other people, they desperately do. They not desperate in a bad way, but it's just really important to them. And they want a relationship where they can. And all I'm suggesting here is find out what your needs are and set this up in a way where your needs can be met. Okay, principle number 4 I want to talk about. So 1, what are your values? 2, what are your non-negotiables? 3, set boundaries as needed. And number 4, validate does not mean agree. Acceptance does not mean agree. And what I mean by that is if you're in a mixed political marriage and your spouse has a different opinion, or your extended family has a different opinion, or your brother or sister or your mom or your dad have a different political opinion, you can still validate and listen to them. That does not mean, let me say that a different way, that does not mean you agree. You can accept that that's who they are. You can accept that that's their point of view. And that doesn't mean that you agree. You can say, I hear you. I understand. Thank you for sharing that. I can tell this is important to you. You can say all of those things, and that does not mean that you agree. This is one of the most important skills, I think, for a mixed political or a mixed faith marriage, really just any relationship, is learning to validate and accept the other person. And demonstrating that to the other person does not mean you agree with what they're saying or what they're doing or how they're voting. But validating and accepting the other person without trying to change them or convince them to be different than who they are or to think differently than they think or feel differently than they feel. Such a powerful skill to have in a relationship. So, however, the election went down for you, your family, how are you feeling about that? Remember these 4 things. What are your values? Anchor yourself, your decisions in those values. What are your non negotiables? What boundaries might you need to set? And remember, you can validate and accept other people without ever, ever, ever agreeing with their views. All right, wishing you the very best in your mixed faith marriage or your mixed political marriage.